This is a green book. It's a facsimile version. And it was a very small glove compartment size guide that was created by Victor Green and his wife Alma from 1936 to 1966. And it's a state-by-state listing that told you places that you could stay as you were traveling across the United States.
Tonight's event is especially meaningful as the tale Gretchen has told is at once a personal history and also a poignant and searing history of racial discrimination across the United States. Driving While Black is indeed a family story highlighting today's most critical issues and injustices and calling us to action. Gretchen Sorin is a distinguished professor and director of the Cooperstown Graduate Project at the State University of New York. We are so happy she is here with us. Before she starts, we have a few more introductions though. First, from the Boston Public Library. Kristen?
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Margaret, and hello to everyone here. On behalf of the Boston Public Library, welcome. I'm Kristen Motti, Adult Programs Librarian at the Central Library in Copley Square. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation with Gretchen Sorin and Kinshasha Conwill. The library has a new theme for our events this year, Repairing America, where our aim is to help people become more resilient and better able to face the challenges of today. And we invite you to join us in the ongoing conversation. And we are thrilled to introduce a new partner this evening for this conversation. The Museum of African American History here in Boston and in Nantucket. Lemertie Frazier is a visual artist, performance artist, educator, and activist. She is the Director of Education at the Museum of African American History. She is also an artist in the African American Master Artist in Residence program at Northeastern University. Welcome, Lemertie. We're so happy to have you here with us this evening.
Thank you. I am delighted, as is the Museum of African American History, to partner in this collaboration to present this very vital conversation and discussion tonight. We welcome you from our sites in Boston and Nantucket, which both house an African Meeting House. The African Meeting House built in Boston in 1806, and that built in Nantucket in around the 1820s. Critical to this program is Kinshasha Holman Conwill. She serves as Deputy Director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Since 2005 to the present, she has engaged in fulfilling the museum's vision by expanding its collections, fostering external partnerships, developing exhibits and programming. She serves as a lead editor for projects ranging from exhibition catalogs to books on the museum's collections, including Dream a World Anew, The African American Experience and the Shaping of America, and We Return Fighting, World War I and the Shaping of Modern Black Identity. Prior to joining the Smithsonian, she served as the director of the Studio Museum in Harlem. It is my delight to have Kinshasha here with us to bring points to us, because I've known Kinshasha for a very long time in the art arena and know her to be someone who really is determined that we understand the African American experience. And so it is my delight to see her in conversation with Gretchen Sorin. Before we welcome Gretchen to read a selection from Driving While Black, we want to highlight that you can purchase a signed copy of the book from our partners at Porter Square Books, either online or by phone. Their contact information is up on the screen, as you will see, as well as a coupon code that you can use for free shipping. Thank you. And now over to Gretchen and Driving While Black.
Thank you, Lemertie and Kristen and Margaret. It's really terrific to be here this evening. I thought that I would start with my reading before I talk a little bit about the book and show you a few of the pictures that are in the book. This is from the introduction. Good roads beckon to you and me. Daily we grow more motor-wise. The nomad in the poorest and the mightiest of us sends us behind the wheel, north, south, east, and west, in answer to the call of the road. But there is still a cloud that stands between us and complete motor travel freedom. On the trail, this cloud rarely troubles us in the morning, but as the afternoon wears on, it casts a shadow of apprehension on our hearts and sours us a little. Where, it asks, will you stay tonight? Alfred Edgar Smith, 1933. Since the beginning of the 20th century, no feature of modern life has been more emblematic of or deeply connected to American identity and the American dream than the automobile. The automobile dramatically changed life in the United States, a subject documented extensively in both popular culture and scholarly works of social, economic, and cultural history. Cars altered the physical landscape of the nation and transformed its culture. As large numbers of Americans moved from the cities to the suburbs, they used their cars to commute to work. Highways traversed and connected cities, but bypassed many rural communities, often leaving them in difficult economic circumstances. The national economy flourished with the factory production of automobiles, car parts, and tires. Automobile workers were among those who joined the ranks of the middle class and purchased cars of their own. Anyone who could buy a car could usually also afford leisure travel, and cars took families on vacations, expanding tourism to become one of the nation's largest industries. As women became car buyers and drivers, their lives changed as well, giving them more independence. Cars even changed courtship patterns, as the back seat provided opportunities for teenage sexual encounters. Automobiles enabled people and goods to move through the country rapidly and increased interconnectedness across a vast nation, while at the same time creating a new pastime, driving. Not everyone celebrated the automobile. Over the decades and even to the present, many commentators argued that it was an atomizing force, not to mention one causing widespread environmental harm and loss of life. Still, the dominant view of the car was as a symbol of freedom, independence, and possibility. Yet those who celebrated the automobile and the ideal of the open road, in most cases, wittingly or not, limited their perspectives to white Americans. For African Americans, the automobile held distinct importance and promise. It made self-directed travel a possibility when travel by bus and train, controlled by others, could lead to humiliating and even life-threatening encounters. Owning a car demonstrated Black American success in a nation where that success was often thwarted. With a growing Black middle class, more and more Black Americans could purchase automobiles, and they used their cars and their consumer dollars not merely to vacation, although they did do that, but also as weapons against segregation. Even many who were not in the middle class found ways to buy cars, seeking any alternative to public transportation, since they were often barred by law and custom from securing mortgages and buying houses. Still, each car trip could be fraught with anxiety, and it required special preparations and careful planning to ensure success. This is really a story about mobility. And what I'd like you to really think about what it means to have the freedom of mobility and how that mobility for African Americans was restricted from the very beginning. And this is a slave pass, a pass that was required if a slave was traveling off of their plantation. And this is also a very personal story for me, and it was a story of personal discovery. When I began this project, I didn't realize how involved it would be with my own life. But as I worked on it and as I wrote the book, I decided that it was going to be very important for me to incorporate some of my own stories into the process. So the Great Migration was really key to this story. And the Great Migration is when as many as 6 million African Americans went from being a rural people to being an urban people, moving from the rural South to the urban North, and gained greater access to the American dream and greater access to disposable income, which gave them the opportunity to purchase automobiles and to get away from segregation. And this is a story that incorporates a wide variety of oral histories. And as a 20th century historian and as an exhibition curator, you can tell my book included lots of pictures, and it also included the stories of many individuals who told me about their experiences in Jim Crow America and their experiences with automobiles. So this is a story about, as I said, about mobility. It's also a story about personal dignity, personal agency, and about civil rights. And it's about how the automobile enabled African Americans to achieve all of those things. But as African Americans traveled, the irony is that they still faced racism along the road. They faced it in road signs, they faced it in sundown town signs, and they faced it just in businesses like this one. This is a sign for a chain of restaurants on the West Coast called the Coon Chicken Inns. And this is also a story about the way that African Americans coped with the racism that they found on the road, and about the Negro Motorist's Green Book, which many of you have probably heard about, and you've perhaps seen the movie Green Book. That was an African American travel guide used by African Americans to find places that they could stay where they were welcome. But the Green Book was only one of a myriad travel guides that existed in a world, a parallel world that African Americans created that most white Americans are completely unaware of. So that's a little bit of an overview of the book.
For those of you who don't know this marvelous woman, she is an educator, she is a writer, she is a leader of one of the most important museum training programs in the country. And she, as you taught Gretchen about these intersections of agency and the denial of agency, as you talked about the car as this wonderful model of agency, you also talked about this undercurrent of a fraught nature. You also, in the brilliant juxtaposition of your personal family story and the story of Black people, you really give people insight into the interior life of Black people in this period. And you kindly mentioned other references, which we'll talk about more later, the Green Book itself, the movie The Green Book, which has very little to do with the Green Book. But that said, one of the many important things you talk about when you talk about your father, you talk about trauma. And we're going to talk more about the car as a vehicle of freedom, as a vehicle of resistance. But I think not enough people understand the trauma of what it meant to be an African American in the 1950s. Can you talk a little bit more? Particularly, you tell a wonderful story, wonderful in that you tell it well, but touching in that you talk about what it did to your father to go home, to his wife's home, to your mother's home, and talk a little bit about that impact of that.
I think that for me, this was really an opportunity to kind of understand my parents and understand their behavior. And my brother and I were always protected from the Jim Crow humiliation. We were in the back seat. And interestingly, when I did the oral histories and talked to Lonnie Bunch and Spencer Crew and other people, who were the children riding in the back seat, they too were protected from this kind of humiliation. But my mother was from Fayetteville, North Carolina, which was a notoriously racist city. And she met my father when he, in 1941, was sent to Fort Bragg as a recruit for World War II. And he hated the South. He hated the Jim Crow South. He was a New Yorker. And of course, my mother grew up with this. So she would always say, well, I knew the good people. And I stayed with the, I stayed with the good people. But my father hated it. And he would drive us to Fayetteville every summer and drop us off and then go home. And then a week and a half or 2 weeks later, come back and pick us up because he couldn't stand to remain in the South. And this would have been in the early 70s, the late 60s. And my brother and I never understood why he really didn't want to stay. But it was incredibly traumatic. We would rise at 3 o'clock in the morning and leave Newark, New Jersey to go to Fayetteville when it was still dark. And as I was doing the research, I discovered that a lot of African Americans like to drive in the dark, because if you're driving in the dark, it's very difficult to tell who's driving the car. So you're less likely to be stopped by the police if they can't tell who's driving. And that made perfect sense. It was also one of the reasons that so many people got into car accidents, because they drove from midnight to the wee hours of the morning and might fall asleep at the wheel, which is what happened to Charles Drew. Driving from Washington.
Who Charles Drew was?
Charles Drew was basically the father of blood banking. He was the man that really saved myriad lives during World War II with his establishing blood banks. And he was a physician working in DC. He and 3 other physicians were driving to Tuskegee, and they left at midnight so that they could drive peacefully without being accosted. And of course, all the physicians in the car fell asleep, and he fell asleep at the wheel and ended up being killed as a result of a car accident.
All of that great Black intelligence lost in just a flash of a moment. When you talked about your interviews, one of the things you quote Spencer Crew as saying, historian Spencer Crew, interim director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, he says, that big old car was like a cocoon. We didn't know anything except what we saw out the side windows. And he said, as little one, our parents protected us from all the racist stuff along the road. And again, something I don't think a lot of people know, but let's talk about another part of this. Let's talk about mobility. Today, the president of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker, was on CBS this morning, and he talked about America. And just not only being a place, but he said, America is also an idea. It's an idea of mobility and a better life for your children. To me, it could have been a blurb for your great book. Talk about the car as literally a vehicle of mobility for Black people in various ways.
So before automobiles, people generally stayed put. They could take buses, they could take trains, but they generally stayed put. With the automobile, people were able to get out and go across the country. And one of the things that was so important for especially the Black middle class was to educate their children. They wanted to go to monuments. They wanted to take their children to museums. They wanted their children to have the opportunity to see the country, just as white families did. The problem was that if you think about the country as a geographic space, the country was really divided into white spaces and Black spaces, with most of the spaces being white spaces. There were certainly some Black spaces. There were Black resorts, a few Black resorts. There were a few Black beaches. There were Black neighborhoods, Black communities. But most of the country was white spaces, and African Americans were not wanted in white spaces and were really genuinely afraid of traversing white spaces. Now, the interstate highways become very important because the highway prevents you from having to drive through little towns where you would encounter small police departments and you don't know exactly how you might be greeted. You might be greeted by an angry mob. You might be greeted and have your car turned over. So the highways, the interstate highways, give some measure of protection, but there are also state troopers on those highways who may stop African-American families disproportionately. So mobility was incredibly important, but at the same time it was restricted by police departments, by angry communities, and by communities that saw the space within the community as white space. And if you think about Ahmaud Arbery, he was running, he was jogging in a community. The people in that community, or the three men in that community, decided that that was a white space and he wasn't welcome in that white space, and they murdered him.
Yes, yes. And you have a very poignant juxtaposition of not only do you talk about your family, but you talk about these incredible African-American leaders, and particularly somebody like Dr. Du Bois, who loved his big old car, didn't he? And drove everywhere. And it almost seemed like he'd think of a place to go just so he could drive his car there, right?
Exactly, drove all over.
Yes, but then you tell a very, it's in a few moments, but the poignant notion that also Medgar Evers, the great secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi, tell us about, first if you could start about why he got the kind of car he did and what he did with the car, and then tell us a little bit about the end of his life.
I was really curious about why people buy the cars that they buy. Why, my parents always bought Ford station wagons. Why did they buy Ford station wagons? And one of the things that I discovered was that African-American newspapers did surveys of consumer products, and they surveyed people about cars. And the most popular cars were these big, hulking Buicks and Oldsmobiles. And I dug a little deeper, asking people, why did you buy a big hulking Buick or big Oldsmobile? African Americans had to carry extra things when they traveled that white Americans never thought about. So if you were an African American, you might carry extra gasoline, so a couple of gallons of gas. You might carry extra water for your radiator in case there was a problem with the radiator, extra fan belts. You definitely carried pillows and blankets in case you had to sleep in the car, because there were no hotels that would accept you. And my parents always carried a big old Holman cooler.
Yes, that's right.
Chicken and hard-boiled eggs and all kinds of food, because you couldn't stop at a restaurant.
That's right.
By the side of the road. So you can imagine you need a big car if you're carrying all of these supplies. And of course, you would carry a large coffee can as a pee can, just in case, because you couldn't stop at a restroom at a gas station.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason for buying a car was very specific, and they're very closely tied to identity.
Mm-hmm.
For Medgar Evers, he was driving all around Mississippi looking at churches that had been burned and looking at people who had been lynched, people investigating murders. Mm-hmm. And he needed a car that was fast. And he needed a car that if he just touched the accelerator, it would take off. And so he chose the Rocket 88, which was a big car. He was also over 6 feet tall, and he sometimes had to sleep in that car. And the Rocket 88 was a nice wide car that would enable him to sleep on the seats. No bucket seats in those days.
Mm-hmm. So you had plenty of room. Fortunately, and in talking about cars, ironically, sadly, he was murdered in the carport driveway of his own home. Yes. Talk about the car a little bit in civil rights. Tell us a little bit about maybe when the car and cars came in handy in the city of Montgomery.
Yeah, I was thinking about how the civil rights movement could not have happened the way it did without the automobile.
Yes.
And if you're thinking about voter registration, you had to have, if you were in charge of an entire county and you were registering voters, you had to have a car so that you could drive all over that county and register voters. Mm-hmm. And you were going to put a bus boycott in effect, as they did in Montgomery. How did people get to work? People had to get to work if they were going to keep their jobs and if the bus boycott was going to be successful. So what Martin Luther King did was to buy a fleet of cars, and he used those cars to drive people to work every day. Mm-hmm. And that made the bus boycott successful. They were able to cut the bus revenue by 69%. It was amazing. And it was used, the same method was used in boycotts in Florida and in other states as well. All you needed was a group of cars that you could use to drive people to work, and black taxi cabs.
You talk about Black agency. You also talk about, and you mentioned Black businesses. There were Black resorts. There were places that the Green Book directed folks to. Do two things. Talk about, please, the Green Book, what it was, what it led people to, and then I want to talk briefly about desegregation and what it did to the world of Black businesses. But let's talk first about the Green Book. Tell our audience, what's the Green Book?
This is a Green Book. It's a facsimile version. And it was a very small glove compartment size guide that was created by Victor Green and his wife Alma from 1936 to 1966. And it's a state-by-state listing that told you places that you could stay as you were traveling across the United States. It starts out as just a New York, Connecticut, expands to Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and then it's the entire East Coast, all the way out to Chicago. And then by 1966, it covers the entire world: Africa, Canada, Mexico, Europe, Caribbean. This was a guidebook that listed restaurants and tourist homes, hotels, motels, gas stations, and later on pharmacists, doctors, hairdressers, any place that offered a service that an African American might need as they traveled.
You weave so beautifully events that were happening in the world, not just the Black world, but the world. World War II, an important period for the changing status of Black people. Black soldiers go and fight for freedom for the world in Europe and Asia, and they come back expecting that double victory. Yes, yet they come back and they don't get that. So there's that notion of the world events that are a part of this story, but there's also the events in the U.S., the passage of laws that change the status of Black people, and when cities, municipalities, states adhere to those laws and when they don't, but eventually that, at least even if it was not practiced, there was the de jure reality of desegregation. What did that do that changed the way Black people traveled? What did it do to Black businesses, perhaps, that people might have used for their travels when they could now go, in certain places at least, wherever they wanted to go?
I think the great irony is that there was this incredible network of these tourist homes and guest houses, hotels and motels, little shops, little stores all over especially the eastern United States to Chicago. Mm-hmm. Not as many as you left Chicago to go west, but definitely quite a few along the West Coast. And what happens is that there are many challenges by the NAACP and other organizations, challenges to Sheraton Hotel, the Hilton Hotel, Howard Johnson's, legal challenges, and they are forced open. They're forced to open to African Americans. And when African Americans can use these services, they do, because they have fought so hard to be able to go to the Hilton, to be able to go to Howard Johnson's. And therefore, African American businesses start to decline, and really many go out of business. And that's the really sad thing about the Negro Motorist Green Book. I know quite a few people have tried to follow the Green Book and follow historic routes that their parents took or their grandparents took. And many of the Green Book sites are no longer there because they were either urban renewed in the 1960s, or they went out of business as a result of the opening up of other businesses to African Americans.
You know, I thank you so much. I have already incorporated some questions that we got a little early, and you brilliantly covered them. You talked about the Green Book, and you talked about actually traffic accidents. You talked about the tragedy of Dr. Drew, and you talked about.
One thing about traffic accidents. I think
Pardon?
I'd like to
Please.
add one thing about traffic accidents.
Please do.
Healthcare was segregated, and hospitals were segregated. And in the late 50s and early 60s, there were only 200 Black hospitals in the United States.
Wow.
And if you happened to live near a really good one, like Howard University had a good Black hospital, Meharry Medical School had a good Black hospital, but many Black hospitals were underfunded. They didn't have the equipment that they needed. They weren't trauma hospitals. So if you got into a car accident that was not near a Black hospital, you were in big trouble. And so Bessie Smith dies, she bleeds to death because there's no hospital that will take care of her. And this happened all over the United States. There were even some some colleges that would not permit their athletes to travel because they were afraid that if they got into an accident, they would die on the road. So when an African American went out on the road, they were really taking a chance that they wouldn't have an accident and that they wouldn't be so severely injured that they would need a hospital.
Yes, because it was a life-threatening moment. We've got some great questions. You've got a lot of fans in the Q&A. I'm totally jealous. And I think if the organizers can save some of those, because there are people who are asking specifically about states like Maine, where there were particular places that were owned by Black people. And one person is saying wonderfully how your story is their story, because, and I could have said that a million times, the picture of you and your dear brother, that's like me and my brothers. Same, looks like we were wearing the same clothes. But, you know, but we did have our own clothes. But do you want to say anything more about some of the specific named places that, not necessarily in New England, but we are talking to a New England audience as well, but that were renowned for where Black people could stay in those moments?
I will tell you that one of the good things about having a national network of alumni, and I actually saw a couple of them that are here this evening. One of the great things about that is that one of our alums called me in the middle of my research on a Wednesday. I remember it was a Wednesday because he said to me, we have this wonderful tourist home. It's called Rock Rest, and it's in Kittery, Maine. And Rock Rest is, the owner had a diary. And I said, a diary? I'll be there Friday. And I put my family in the car and we drove to Maine on Friday night, and I transcribed the diary of the Sinclair's diary, and learned all about their tourist home. And then I connected the African American Museum, your African American Museum, with Rock Rest, which is how all of the artifacts from the tourist home ended up at the Smithsonian, which I'm thrilled about because they would not have been necessarily preserved. So I think that's a wonderful thing. But Rock Rest operated for a long time, and it was this absolutely wonderful place that people went year after year, and they would stay for a week or so, or 2 weeks. And what was so important, I think, it gave people a respite from racism. You know, it was an all-Black tourist home, and you would go and you could just relax and not be confronted with any of the racism that was part of the rest of society, which really affected African-American health. There's a lot of research now that shows that African-American high blood pressure and depression really some of it is a result of racism. So I can imagine how wonderful it was to be able to take a week and go to a place like Rock Rest, which was near the ocean in New England, and just have that break. It was also a place where African-American parents would stop when they were taking their children to school. Mm-hmm. They were headed to Bowdoin, which did accept African-Americans. They would stop at Rock Rest. And we know that because they wrote letters to Hazel Sinclair asking if she had space.
You're giving another example of how your book opens up so many other stories. It's a great book to read as any person would read it, but it's a great book to read for students and for researchers, because you just take one branch of the tree you have planted and there's a whole other story. An interesting question that our audience wants to know, and your friends in Maine are very happy now that you asked that question. Women, did women drive? We talk a lot about your dad and other men, Medgar Evers, W.B. Du Bois. How about women?
There were some women that drove. I do write a lot about the fact that most women, like my mother, were in the passenger seat. She drove when she went to, my mother drove when she went to work every day. But when we were going to church or we were going somewhere with my father, he always drove. I can't even remember a time when he sat in the passenger seat. Most of the drivers were men, and most of the stories that I encountered about drivers were men, and most of the navigators were women. Most of the planners, the vacation planners, were most of the people that were looking for the hotels and motels and places to stay and places to eat were women.
And they fried that chicken and boiled those eggs.
That's right.
Dressed their young children in those beautiful traveling outfits, because you always wanted to look good when you arrived at not only these places that are in the Green Book, but also often Black people stayed at homes of friends, right? They didn't just stay in hotels or motels where they paid.
In fact, the very earliest Green Books are really about places that women opening up their homes with a spare room or two, and listing Mrs. George Smith's guest house or Jane Jones guest house. The very early Green Books are really mostly colored YMCAs and women who are making a little extra money for their family by providing basically an early bed and breakfast. You know, they're providing a really good breakfast and sometimes even dinner, but they're also providing a room for the night.
Wonderful. There are calls for an audio book for you, Dr. Sorin, so please prepare to do that. I don't know if I'm allowed to say something about something else when you think of things like video, audio, film. Maybe I'm supposed to be quiet about that, and one of the organizers of you will tell me. So while they're thinking about whether I can say that, I want to remind our viewers that they can order Driving While Black from Porter Square Books and get it shipped for free. So please look in the chat for that information, because if we don't sell some books, I'm gonna feel like I failed. Buy the, back in the 60s, they said, steal this book, buy this book. Do not shoplift this book, buy this book. Does there need to be a Green Book today? Ask a couple of your listeners.
That's an interesting question. There is a woman in Minnesota, I believe, or Wisconsin, somewhere in the Midwest, who has written a Green Book for today. And who is kind of looking, I think you would really have, I think a Green Book for today would need to look at police departments and talk about which police departments were not very favorably disposed toward Black people. The problem is that there are 17,000 police departments in the United States.
Yikes.
No single body that oversees them all. They're all individual police departments. So it would be a very difficult book to write.
Yes, indeed. Well, perhaps things may be, the load may be lightened if people watch something that will be coming up soon. There's a young man I met, well, he was younger then, when I was visiting you in Cooperstown many years ago. He was working on a documentary called New York, a Documentary. The lad is named Rick Burns. I think you and he have some plans coming up, do you?
We have some plans. Yeah, Rick and I are old friends, and I approached him after we were on a panel at OAH together, the Organization of American Historians. And I asked him if he would look at my pictures, because as a curator, I gathered a lot of pictures related to this story. And I showed him the pictures and I said, I think this story really needs to be a documentary. And we, what's terrific about it is, now we're talking about how important it is to have white allies working with Black people in the development, in pushing civil rights forward. And that we have a moment now with COVID and with the unfortunate murder of George Floyd. There's a moment where white allies have joined with Black people. And I thought, well, Rick and I did this 5 years ago. And we started working on this 5 years ago. So we knew that was something that was very important. So we're working on a documentary called Driving While Black, which will be on PBS nationwide, October 13th.
That's exciting. Well, this is a good moment for me to exit, but do not go away, friends, as they used to say in the 50s. We'll be right back. So I'm gonna be off the screen, but Gretchen's not going anywhere because we're gonna make her stay because she's so fabulous. And I think maybe Gretchen is going to read something else from her book. As I say, not goodbye, but I go off screen. Gretchen, thank you.
Thank you, Kinshasha, so much.
Don't go away. All right.
I am going to read a little something from the end of the book, from the epilogue. When our son Gregory reached the age of 16, he anxiously awaited the moment when he would get his driver's permit. Because we live in a rural area, my husband Martin and I took him out to drive on backcountry roads and made him practice driving in snow. He even learned what to do if a deer ran in front of the car. Most important, I cautioned him to be extremely careful if a policeman stopped him. Keep your hands on the wheel, I said. Don't reach for anything, your cell phone or your wallet. Be extremely polite. Don't give him any reason to get angry or to get nervous. My son, and later Rob, my son-in-law, chided me for these warnings. I know, Mom. Don't worry so much, Mom. I couldn't imagine anyone assuming that either of these kind, sweet men could be dangerous, but I do worry. Recently, when the Driving While Black team gathered a group of senior American historians together to discuss the themes of this book and the accompanying documentary film, my son heard similar warnings from the African American members of the group. If you are stopped by the police, your job, my colleague Faith Ruffins, senior curator at the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian, said, is to live long enough so that we can get to you. We have to assume that a policeman stopping a Black driver will be adversarial, not respectful, suspicious and afraid of you just because of the color of your skin. I will admit it, I am afraid of the police. This doesn't mean that I am anti-police or that I believe all policemen and policewomen are anti-Black. It means that as an African-American woman and a historian familiar with the history of the relationship between African-Americans and law enforcement, I don't want to encounter that policeman who will be terrified of me or one of my family members, or who may be a racist bent on killing Black people because they know they will get away with it. Sadly, police misconduct seems all too often to result in the death sentence being handed down to an unarmed driver. I am also aware that many individuals and groups have pushed our society in the direction of greater equality for all Americans. We have come a long way since my father's drives through the night on the way down to Fayetteville, when he feared what might happen if he stopped at any moment. Yet I still must warn my son that driving while Black can get you killed.
Well, thank you so much, Gretchen, for this wonderful revealing of your book. As a child of the South, in a car driving up and down the East Coast with my family and my mother, I am thrilled about this book and your work. Thank you, Gretchen and Kinshasha, for taking us on this truncated journey through a marvelous reveal of how and why some of these things were happening at this time. So it is with great admiration for the research that you've done and the honor that we have in witnessing your exploration of this subject, unlike any I've ever heard. So I would like to thank you from the Museum of African American History and we like to thank the audience for joining us tonight and hope that they will purchase your book, as Kinshasha has said. We join her in that. We also want to say thank you to the library and WGBH for including us as partners in this very important event.
Thank you, Lamerchi. Thank you for joining us tonight, Museum of African American History. Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you, Kinshasha. What a thought-provoking conversation, an important conversation.
Thank you, Gretchen, Kinshasha, our partners at BPL. Kristen, it's an honor, as always, and Museum of African American History. Lamerchi, welcome on board our triumvirate here for a couple of readings coming up. We will all be looking forward to the PBS documentary of Driving While Black with Rick Burns, airing October 13. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you again to our fabulous partners tonight and our guests. Bless you all, and have a good night.